There are things in our home life that you don't see that I do. And it's because we've been raised in this certain way where you don't have to see those things. And I am pressured to keep everyone comfortable and happy. Like, let's talk about the big ideas, the big cultural things that are happening.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and to celebrate this International Women's Day, you are listening to a very special episode of No Filter, candid conversations that count. A woman's work is never done. No, really, it's not. Whether she's at home or in the office, there's a whole layer of labour that's done predominantly by women that most men can't even see. Emotional labour is being the person who notices problems and delegates solutions and makes sure life is going smoothly for everyone around her. It's noticing there's barely any milk left and then doing something about it. It's changing the toilet roll when it's run out. It's knowing the names of all the teachers or the carers. It's being in the class WhatsApp groups and being the one to organise the birthday cake at work and make sure everyone signed Jane's card before she goes off on maternity leave. Emotional labour is being the one to take notes in meetings or make small talk in the office kitchen so that things aren't awkward. And emotional labour is swallowing down the inevitable build-up of resentment that's caused by being the one who knows all the things and smooths the path for all the people she works and lives with. This work is invisible and exhausting at the same time, and it's not just something experienced by mothers or women in relationships. Emotional labour has also been called the mental load, and most days, in most ways, it is women's work. A couple of years ago, writer Gemma Hartley wrote an essay about emotional labour after a particularly disastrous Mother's Day that left her in tears. It went mega viral, and it led to her writing a whole book on the subject. That book is called Fed Up, and Gemma joins me now to talk about it. Gemma, welcome and congratulations on your sensational book.
Thank you.
Your interest in emotional labour started with an essay that you wrote for Harper's Bazaar around Mother's Day.
Yes.
A couple of years ago. Paint me a little bit of a picture of your life leading up to Mother's Day.
Oh, it's hard to think back that far, but I was staying at home with my 3 children while also freelancing full-time.
How old were your kids?
They were 2, 4, and 6 at the time.
Whew.
Yeah, that's a hard time right there. And actually, they might have been a bit younger at the time of Mother's Day. They might have been just shy of 2 and 4. So I was taking care of all of their needs, both their emotional needs, their physical needs, thinking about everything that needed to be done for them. And then I was also juggling a full-time freelance career. And so I was under a lot of stress. And I have a husband who is really wonderful and has always helped out around the house, but that's not really the same as taking responsibility for the home and for the kids. And so the emotional labor was really weighing on me.
It's funny, when you've got little kids and it's Mother's Day, usually all a woman wants is actually to be on her own.
Yeah.
And to be relieved of parental responsibilities on Mother's Day.
Yes, because you're on all the time. And so that was really my default, was that on Mother's Day, I kind of wanted a break from mothering, and which, leads to all of this guilt and all of those other feelings. But I wanted a break, and that is not what I got.
You asked your husband quite specifically for something that you did want. What did you want?
I wanted him to hire in a cleaning service to deep clean the bathrooms, a very, very specific gift. And I asked for that gift in specific not because I didn't want to clean the bathrooms, but because I wanted to try out a cleaning service for our home to see if I could offload some of that, labor that I was doing constantly that was becoming too much with a full-time job and kids.
And by deep cleaning, you meant the toilets?
Yeah, doing
scrubbing.
The toilets and the showers and, washing the windows outside, something along those lines. But I had been putting it off, too, because I knew all the work that would go into that, finding a service, asking for recommendations from friends, making sure it would fit within our family budget, which is pretty tight when you've got 3 kids. So it was a big undertaking, and that's why I asked for a gift. I thought, this is perfect. But that's not quite what I got.
How did he react?
So he kept asking if there was something else that I wanted. He thought that I was just like angry that the bathrooms were dirty, and I'm like, no, they're not that bad. I really want this gift. I'm not just saying this. It's not like you getting me a vacuum cleaner without me asking for it on Mother's Day or anything like that.
It wasn't a passive aggressive request.
No,
that was meant to say, hey, clean the bathrooms.
Yes, and I think that's what he thought it was at first, and I kept talking to him about it. I'm like, no, it's not passive aggressive. It's just something that I want. It would make a really lovely gift for me on Mother's Day. And so he kept putting it off until it was a bit too late. The day before Mother's Day was when he finally got around to calling one service, and he was like, oh, that service was really expensive to have them, come in tomorrow on a Sunday. And I'm like, oh, gosh, So he decided he would clean the bathrooms himself on Mother's Day while I watched our 3 children and sort of had the house go to hell.
So he would have thought, from his point of view, I'm giving her what she asked for. The bathrooms are going to be so clean. How were you feeling on that day? Because he would have been feeling pretty proud of himself, I imagine.
He was.
Like he was a hero.
Yeah, he thought that he was doing exactly what I wanted. Like, in his mind, he was really fulfilling what I had asked for, which was clean bathrooms, even though that, in my mind, wasn't what I asked for. So he had, gone to the store, armed himself with everything he needed to get the bathrooms really clean, and had just taken off and hidden away in the bathrooms. And throughout the day, I was taking care of the kids, sort of, figuring out everything that needed to be done. I had anticipated a Mother's Day that would be very relaxing, and that was not what was happening. So I was figuring out what they needed to eat for lunch and what needed to be done around the house. I was picking up my husband's shoes off the floor and went to take them into the closet. And he was a little miffed that I wouldn't come and look at the bathrooms and how clean they were getting, because I was so full of resentment in that moment, because I was like, this isn't what I asked for. I'm not getting what I need here.
The moment you sort of cracked it was when you were in your closet and there was a box in the way. Tell me about that.
Oh, the box. We joke about that box a lot now. So there's a box of gift wrap that goes up on a high shelf in our closet. And my husband had gotten it down a few days before Mother's Day, because since he did not get me the cleaning service, he got me a necklace instead. And so he had wrapped it and wrapped his mother's gift, and then did not put away the box. And it sat there for days, and I had been a little angry about the box already, but I'm like, he's going to put it away. Like, he's got to see that it's right in the middle of the closet. Like, I can't get to my clothes. I can't get to the hamper. Like, he'll figure it out, won't he? And he didn't. And so when I banged it into it on Mother's Day, I was so angry and so full of resentment at that point. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to ask him to do this. He should know to do this. And so I very passive-aggressively grabbed a chair from the kitchen, drug it all the way through the house, and went and, heaved it onto the shelf on my own, at which point he comes out of the bathroom and says, well, if you wanted that put away, all you had to do was ask.
I'm going to get you at this point to read an excerpt from your book about what happened after that and why this was such a pivotal point in your understanding and his understanding of emotional labour.
All right. It was obvious that the box was in the way and needed to be put back. It would have been easy for him to just reach up and put it away, but instead he had stepped around it, willfully ignoring it for 2 days. It was up to me to tell him that he should put away something he had taken out in the first place. That's the point, I said, now in tears. I don't want to have to ask. And therein lay the problem. It was a simple and obvious task that required minimal effort from him. So why hadn't he done it? Why did I always have to ask? It was a question that led to a tear-filled fight as I tried to get my husband to grasp why it's exhausting to be the household manager who notices problems, delegates solutions, and has to ask in a sing-song voice to get anyone to comply. How I find myself carrying all the domestic upkeep that relieves others of the mental load. I'm the one who notices when things need to be done, and my options are limited. I either complete these tasks myself or delegate them out to others. If we're running low on milk, I put it on my grocery list or ask my husband to pick it up at the store, even if he was the one to use the last drop. I'm the one who notices when the bathroom or kitchen or bedroom needs to be cleaned, and my attention to all the details often makes one task turn into 20. I start taking socks to the laundry, then notice a toy needs to be put away, which leads to tidying the playroom, and then a stray bowl needs to be put in the sink, so I do the dishes, and the cycle continues ad nauseum. Housework isn't the only thing that becomes a drag. I'm also the schedule keeper who makes appointments and knows what's on the calendar at all times. I'm the person who has all the answers to where my husband left his keys, what time that wedding is, and what type of dress code is necessary. Do we have any orange juice left? Where is that green sweater? When is so-and-so's birthday? And what are we having for dinner? I carry in my mind exhaustive lists of all types, not because I want to, but because I know no one else will. No one else will read the school handbook. No one else will plan what to bring to our friend's potluck. No one else will lift a finger unless asked, because that is the way it has always been. And yet asking, and asking in the right way, is an additional layer of labor. Delegating, in many situations, requires repeating requests, which is often perceived as nagging. Sometimes it's simply not worth the effort of asking again and again and continually asking in the right tone and still risk being called a nag. So I do the task myself. Many mornings I bring my daughter her shoes to put them on her feet, not because she's incapable, but because I don't want to ask her to put them on 10 or more times before yelling that it's time to leave and no one has their shoes on. When I want my husband to clean up the yard, but I also want to keep the peace, I have to monitor my tone so it doesn't betray the resentment I feel, because he never notices tasks that need to be done without my reminders. I find myself curbing my own emotions to cater to those around me, simply to keep our life running smoothly and fight free. Otherwise, I do all the work myself. My kids certainly don't have to make this choice, and neither does my husband. And it's my job, and it always has been.
Oh, I'm sure that there'll be people nodding so hard their heads are almost falling off listening to your words. After that incident with the box and Mother's Day, you wrote an essay which was published in Harper's Bazaar online and went mega viral and has been read 2 billion times. In the writing of that essay and your husband reading it, what did you both learn and what happened after that?
Well, it was quite a while after Mother's Day that he actually read the essay because I had some time to process it and think about it before I actually wrote it. And it was published in September of that year, and Mother's Day had been in, I believe, May. So there had been some time there, and we had really talked about it since then. And there had been small changes here and there, which was really heartening. You know, my husband was definitely trying to notice what needed to be done, doing it himself, though his understanding of emotional labor was still pretty limited until I was in the process of writing the book. But he did really well considering how many people read about him, you know, royally messing up Mother's Day. He's got pretty thick skin, and I'm really grateful for that.
When you talk about emotional labour, I think you explained it so well in that excerpt that you just read. It's that whole invisible layer, isn't it? And you start your book by saying, an invisible job is never done.
Yes. Yeah, when I'm talking about emotional labor, I'm talking not only about that emotion management work and, you know, all the soothing and ego stroking that we do, but also the mental work that goes into that and the mental work that goes into keeping those around us comfortable and happy. So it's the way that those two intersect and compound.
I just want to stay on your personal story for a moment because when the piece went viral, you got a book deal to write this brilliant book called Fed Up, Navigating and Redefining Emotional Labour for Good. And you needed you had a 6-month deadline. And near the beginning of that time, your husband was laid off. Tell me how that sort of played out in your relationship. You write about it in the book.
Yeah, a lot of this book I wrote about the process of writing the book and sort of how that took us through this journey of learning about emotional labor and what each of our hang-ups were about it and how we came to a better understanding. So really, you know, what would have been a catastrophic event in any other situation was actually really good in terms of writing a book about emotional labor. Having my husband be laid off from work during that time really allowed him to see all of that invisible work that he couldn't wrap his mind around before. So that's why I said, in the time between the writing of that article or, that Mother's Day and the article publishing, there were small changes, but not a lot. The time of writing this book, when he was laid off, that was a huge game changer for us because he really took on my role in the household. And so he had to do that invisible labor, and he had to figure out what it was because I wasn't really around to hold his hand all the time. Or I was in the beginning, but, as my workload increased, I really had to let him figure it out on his own. And that was a really steep learning curve for him. But it really challenged us both to see why we had fallen into these patterns in the first place.
It didn't all go smoothly, though, in terms of it wasn't just that he was laid off, he was at home, you had your book to write, you decided this is when I'm going to be able to lean into work, he's going to be able to lean into the running of the house and the emotional labour it takes to do that. You write about one particular day where you're on deadline, you're trying to work, and he decides to go for a bike ride.
Yes, and, the bike ride would have been fine. I was very okay with him going and taking time for self-care, but I walked in, out of my office into the family room, and things were such a mess. I mean, everything, I write about it in the book, but there was stuff everywhere. I mean, there's this, kinetic sand stuff that kids play with that's like a magnetic type of sand that sticks together. I can't describe how much of it was all over every area of the house. It was awful. And I really had thought, this is the time I'm going to lean into work and he's going to get it and it's going to go so smoothly and wonderfully and he gets emotional labor now. And that day really showed me nope, he doesn't really get it yet. And I don't know how this is going to change. And it was a really hard moment for me. Because I was like, I'm writing the book on emotional labor right now, and it's so clear that it's not happening in my relationship yet. And what if it doesn't get there by the time I'm done writing this book? I'm not going to have a leg to stand on. So we were in this weird space where I really had to figure this out for us. We needed to figure it out so that I could write this book and not feel like an absolute fraud. And so I think by the time he got home and had a shower after his bike ride and realized how nice and clean the house was and how deeply angry I was.
You said he walked in and went, hey, the house is so clean. And then he said, I'm really sorry I didn't do more before I left.
Yep.
And then you said, it still needs a vacuum though.
Yeah.
And you got the vacuum cleaner out.
I left the vacuum out, in my passive-aggressive way. I'm going to put this right here. It did not get vacuumed. I still did the vacuuming. And I know part of this was he was very in his head about finding a job because, men aren't really attuned to emotional labor and they don't have that as a cultural value in the same way that women do. So it was hard for him to make that adjustment. In his mind at that point, I think it was all about, I need to work, I need to provide because that is what society tells me I need to do. And so he hadn't really leaned into that role yet. And that really changed throughout the 6 months of writing this book. But yeah, we got to the end of that day and he's like, this is going in the book, isn't it? I'm like, oh yeah, it is.
What about the people who would say, Gemma, don't be such a control freak. You look around, it's all a mess. Just turn back around and go back into your study and keep working and let him deal with it in his own time.
Yeah, I hear this one a lot, the control freak argument, especially because, I am not shy about my standards for my home. And I write about that in the book. And, I don't like everything to be a mess. The clutter around me really creates a lot of mental clutter, creates a lot of stress. And I think the people that make that argument sometimes have really good intentions where it's just is this really a struggle worth fighting for? And I think it is. Because I think when you're in a relationship and when there are two people that are supposed to be maintaining the home, if you tell one person to just let it all go because the other one does not want to change their standards, it's just letting men completely off the hook for the emotional labor that needs to be done while creating this additional layer of stress, mental stress, emotional stress that can come along with having life not run the way that you're used to. I write a lot in the book about how most of the women I talk to, and I think myself included, we don't create these standards arbitrarily. We don't do it because we really love a clean home or we, really get joy out of doing the vacuuming. It's because we've found that this is the best way to care for our family and to keep everything running in that, really smooth way. And so I think that our standards matter and that we should be able to come to a shared standard that will make everyone happy.
Gemma, is this a male-female thing and generations of conditioning? What happens in same-sex relationships?
So in same-sex relationships, what I found was that they were absolutely still, susceptible to these gender roles that were, sort of forcing on everyone. And so one person who has who's slightly more adept at emotional labor will start to take it on in the same way that women will normally take it on in a heterosexual relationship, where they will take it on a little bit at a time until suddenly they're responsible for everything. And so I think what was really interesting in talking to these couples was that once they started talking about emotional labor, they were able to course correct really quickly because they realized, hey, these roles that we're doing here aren't really working for us. Let's course correct. And I think that's much easier for same-sex couples to do because they are not also dealing with these heterosexual gender norms, which is where it's really coming from. I don't think it's strictly a male-female thing because I also talk to a lot of men who are the primary source of emotional labor in their families. It's really a cultural conditioning thing. And we all have the same aptitude for emotional labor, but I think we really force it on women culturally.
You write in the book about when it comes to emotional labour, men will do it as a means to an end, whereas women do it as just a way of being. What did you mean by that? Yeah,
so I'm talking in that a lot of early relationships that I interviewed during the book would say that, or people that had enjoyed a really nice early relationship compared to where they were now, was that men would really step up their game early on. They would keep everything nice and clean. They would be really emotionally attentive. And it was sort of this way to get the girl. And then once you reach a certain point, once you are in a committed relationship, those standards no longer apply for men, but they always apply for women. We are always supposed to be nurturing, keeping everyone comfortable, keeping everyone happy. So it's really a cultural demand for us, whereas men can get away with not doing it once they're past the courtship phase.
After you started looking into the issue of emotional labour, you read another piece that was sort of going around about, I think, by a woman called Sarah. I've forgotten her surname, but the article was how to tell your husband that maybe you don't want to be married anymore. And she wrote about her own experience of realising that perhaps her marriage was over. And in fact, it was. You interviewed her and you read that article thinking, I'm not going to see any of myself in there because I'm happy in my marriage. I don't want to end it. What did you actually see when you read it?
So when I read that article and when I talked to Sarah, what I saw was that there weren't a whole lot of differences between us because what she was describing was that same resentment that I was talking about in my article, that resentment of feeling invisible in your own life because all of the work that you're doing is just, being swept under the rug and no one's acknowledging it. No one's stepping up to share the tasks. And one thing I found, really sort of frightening when I read her piece was that she would say that they would have these fights like the fight I had on Mother's Day and things would get better for a while. But she knew that it was going to keep reverting. And so that was what really scared me because I was feeling that already where it was, 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. And we just weren't we weren't making any real substantial progress. And I needed to know that wasn't going to be me, or I needed to, really reevaluate my marriage.
So what changed? Was it just time?
I think part of it is, the time. I think part of it was that my husband was laid off and was thrown into this role. But, I have a lot of women ask me, like, how do you have this conversation? What are those magical words that I can tell my husband that'll make it click? And I think it's really important to know that there aren't perfect words. There's no perfect conversation. I think why it changed is that my husband wanted to change, and he wanted to make it work. And, if he was going to call himself, a feminist ally and someone who was on my side, he needed to take the effort to learn what emotional labor was. And so he wanted to do that. And I think that's what makes the difference.
Emotional labor doesn't just exist for women within the confines of relationships or families. There's also an aspect of emotional labor at work. What does that look like? You write about that in the book too.
Yeah. The most common thing I think that I heard was women are asked to take notes a lot in meetings by people who are, their peers or even juniors to them, usually men, will ask them, hey, can you do this little task for me? Can you do this for me? Can I bounce this idea off of you? And they will expect a lot of nurturing and a lot of, just unappreciated work that cuts into your actual focused work time. And then there is also the additional layer of, in order to get ahead, women really have to make themselves likable in the workplace, which is, another thing that I heard a lot was email. You have to word those emails so carefully, and you've got to make sure that you're coming off really nice. And there's just this whole extra layer of keeping everyone comfortable and happy that does not apply to men in the workplace. If a man comes in, goes straight to his desk, gets straight down to work, that's a hardworking man. If a woman does the same, like, oh, what a bitch, she didn't stop and talk to me, she didn't want to do this, she didn't make everyone feel comfortable, she's been wearing the same suit, 3 days in a row, God, she just doesn't care about herself. I mean, there's so many additional pressures for women to, fit this mold that creates comfort for others.
What you say about making life comfortable and easy for others, that's the essence of what emotional labor is, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, as much as I have written about it and as much of an advocate as I am for everyone, learning these skills and not using them in detrimental ways, it's so deeply ingrained. I was out at breakfast this morning, and they brought me a coffee, and I don't drink coffee. I had ordered tea, and I was just like, you know what? I'm probably just going to drink this coffee. And they realized it before I drank it and gave it to the person and got my tea. But I was just like, I'll just drink this because I don't want to cause a fuss in a busy restaurant in the morning. And I know it's perfectly within my right to say, hey, you've messed up my order. Can you get another?
But you didn't want to make them uncomfortable.
But yeah, I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. I didn't want to upset the flow of a bustling breakfast restaurant. So I was just like, I'll just drink this. I'll figure it out. I'll learn to like coffee today.
And you say that the term emotional labor is actually coined to describe professions like flight attendants and nurses who have such a sort of nurturing component to their job or are expected to.
Yeah. Arlie Hochschild really went deep into this work of following around flight attendants and figuring out, what the impact of emotional labor was in the workplace when, they had to have a smile plastered on their face all the time. And if people were rude to them, if people were even, abusive to them on flights, I mean, there were stories of men throwing hot coffee on them and cursing at them and making really lewd sexual advances. And they just had to sort of smile and deal with it and never betray what they're actually feeling. They had to do really deep acting work of saying, this is okay. This is who I am. When I am on this flight, everything is okay. And my only job is to make the customer comfortable. And that took a really big, mental and emotional toll on these women when they would leave their job. They felt like they couldn't turn it off.
When I was reading your book, I was also thinking about emotional labour in friendships. We talk about sometimes on another podcast that we do about the Nicole of a friendship group and how every friendship group has a Nicole. And she's the one that, if you go on holidays, she's the one that's worked out where you're going to have lunch and where the best place is to go shopping. And she's the one that texts everyone and sets up the group chat and texts everyone and reminds them what time the breakfast buffet is going to close. And that's emotional labour, isn't it?
It is. And it does work very deeply into friendships. And I think that is one of the reasons why a Nicole in the group, I am a Nicole in the group.
I'm not shocked.
No, not at all. So I think that's why some friendships really burn out when one person is constantly the one doing the emotional labor for the group. But I did interview quite a wide array of people in the book, and one talked about how that works out in her friendships, how she is always the one to check ahead and make sure everything's okay, and sets up all of the dinners that she's going to have with her friends, sets up all the concerts that they're going to go to, and that's a lot of work. And I think what differs in female friendships is that work is usually really appreciated because we understand what that work entails. We do it a lot in our private lives. And so it's rare that one person, there's going to be one person who is the take charge that does all of it, that really goes all in. But all of the friends are going to say, thank you for doing this. Thank you for arranging this. I see your work. I recognize your work. So I think that makes it a little bit easier than when, say, you have a partner at home who, will do the dishes one time and say, oh my gosh, did you see that I did the dishes? Can you praise me for this, when you've done them 5 times the same day and no one said a word?
There is that sense of the bar being at very different levels. Tell me about what happens when your husband goes to the supermarket with your kids.
Oh, yes. So my husband often takes all the kids out, does the grocery shopping, especially now that we've balanced out emotional labor a bit better. He's out in the world with them probably just as often as I am. He has a very different experience than I do. People stop him. Like, they have to physically stop him and pat him on the back and tell him what an amazing dad he is, what an awesome job he's doing, how brave he is to go out into the world with 3 young. Yes, a real warrior going out into the world with 3 young kids. And when a mom goes out and does that, the most common thing we'll get is you've got your hands full there, with an elbow, or more commonly, one of your kids is acting up and people are sitting there judging you, giving you the side eye, being like, oh, God, why can't that lady get her kids under control? My husband, when I, tell him about that, he's like, I could have all 3 of them lying on the floor and like rolling around red-faced, throwing tantrums, and people would still come and say, oh, so brave, doing your best, Dad.
That's so true, those different standards. And those standards also resonate generationally. So you talk about trying to have a conversation and educate a man or your partner about emotional labour, and them saying, but compared to my father, I do so much more. My dad never changed a nappy, or my grandfather barely knew the names of his children. Look how good I am. And you have a strong retort for that. Yes.
So I think, first of all, correct. You are doing so much more than your dad. But you know what? I didn't marry your dad is the thing I love to say. Or I didn't marry your granddad. I married someone who I expect to be an equal partner. And that means not comparing yourself to other men. Not even, a lot of people will say, look at how much I do compared to my friends or your friends' husbands. They're so lazy. Look at how good I am. And I say, you know what? There's no one else in this relationship except for you and me. And so the only person you need to be comparing your labor to is me. Are we on the same page? Are we doing a shared amount? And I think that's something that will be a wake-up call for men, is that, you're not comparing yourself to your buddies or your dad or your granddad. You're comparing yourself to the other person in this relationship.
How has life changed and your marriage changed since becoming an expert in this topic?
I think the biggest change isn't simply that we've got more balanced emotional labor, which is really wonderful. Like, I can't, overstate how good it's been for our relationship to have that extra mental space and emotional space that I didn't have before. But I think the thing that really has changed for me is that we have a much better understanding of each other. It's brought us a lot closer together because I think what really, made that resentment brew was feeling invisible and feeling like my work was not seen or valued. And now that I know, he sees what I do and he understands what this work entails, even if I am taking on a bit more than he is in a given time frame, I know that he understands it and that he's going to empathize with me when I am talking about everything that I've been doing. And that makes a real difference. And it's not just the mental work, but also that emotional work of connecting and empathizing with others that makes emotional labor so important. And so now that my husband has these skills and is really honing them, he can connect with me on a much deeper level. And so I think it's been the best thing for our relationship because of those aspects, because of the shared understanding that we have of one another's lives, and because of the way that we're able to connect, outside of these really stale gender roles. That has made a huge impact.
For those of us who haven't written an article about emotional labour that's gone viral, how do we bring it up with our partners? Because I imagine for you, you were able to say, see, it's not just me. And there's this great expression that I love that you can guarantee that there's someone out there who has a wound the shape of your words. And your words about emotional labour were an absolute exact fit for this wound or this feeling that so many women had. You could then point to the virality of that article and say, hey, millions of women feel the same way. This isn't just a you and me dynamic. This is real. What about everyone else? What do you suggest are the best ways for making the invisible visible to your partner?
So I think, first of all, I don't think it's unreasonable to, point to the article or to the book and ask your partner to read it. A lot of women feel really put off by that idea. But I think, it goes back to that willingness to learn. I think that's really key, that you have to be open and vulnerable with your partner and say, look, this is something that's really important to me. Will you read this and we'll talk about it? Or, there's lots of articles out there about it that you can use sort of as an in to say, there's a lot of people dealing with this. I want to discuss this. Can we have that discussion? But also I think, most importantly, if you just want to bring it up casually, is don't wait until there's a box in the middle of the closet that you're going to have a meltdown about. I think one of the big things that changed our dynamic was that I would bring things up all the time. Once I was writing the book, I would feel comfortable saying, hey, this is something that I've never talked to you about because I didn't want to be a nag about it. But, now that we're having this open conversation about emotional labor, can we talk about this? I think keeping it out of that really high emotion range is a great starting point. Like, don't go in looking for a fight. And I don't think most women do. But I think the more open you are, the more honest you are,
And I find that it really helps to have concrete examples.
Yes.
To rather than say, you always, you never,
Yeah.
I always, I never. It's
Yes.
better to say the box, the time you went cycling, the vacuum, it's Mother's Day, the specific things that you can point to and explain. I think that's easier than, because often you can bring a well of emotion.
Yes.
And it is invisible to them. They didn't know.
Yeah.
They haven't seen it.
Well, and also when you reach that moment, there is a wealth of information you have that you can bring forward and say, like, you do this and this and this and this. And that really, comes off as an attack because it is in a way. Like you're saying, like, look at all the things you don't do. Why don't you realize this? And so one of the things that's been really helpful, I think, when me and my husband were having this conversation, which was aided by the fact that I was writing the book, is I was delving into all of this really interesting sociological research that showed me why we didn't see each other eye to eye. And so we had a lot more talks, not about, hey, you never put your socks in the hamper, but talks about there are things in our home life that you don't see that I do. And it's because we've been raised in this certain way where you don't have to see those things. And I am pressured to keep everyone comfortable and happy. Like, let's talk about the big ideas, the big cultural things that are happening and why they don't serve us anymore. And I think that's a really easy is to talk about this like cultural problem, because then it's
doesn't
not
feel like
blaming
a
anyone.
attack.
Yeah. And really, when I think about emotional labor and all the stuff that my husband used to not realize and not do, I'm not angry with him, because it's true. It is really invisible to most men. And I would be angry if he didn't take the steps necessary to learn and correct that behavior. But he has at every turn. And so I think that talking about it from a cultural perspective is a really great way to bring it up and to have some talks that will lead to change.
Thank you so much for writing this book, Gemma. It's just outstanding. I have to confess, reading it, I've realised that my husband does a huge amount of the emotional labour in our house, and that a real friction point between us is that. I do different parts of the emotional labour, but I don't think we see each other's work, in that area. So I think it's even just being aware of it, having a name for it and recognising it is just such an important thing, and at work as well.
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think that's so true. One thing to really keep in mind when you're having these conversations is that you're probably overestimating what you do and underestimating what your partner does. Like, that's just part of human nature. There are a lot of studies that prove that is very true. So, keep that in mind.
Gemma Hartley's book is called Fed Up, and I really recommend that you read it. It is a great read. You can buy it at any good bookstore or at apple.co/mamamia. And if you want to hear another story about the mental load, scroll back through the feed and listen to the episode called The Lie Working Mothers Tell, where I speak to Christine Armstrong about women and having it all. Haha. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman. I try to have it all at least for 15 minutes every day, usually when I'm drinking a cup of tea and mucking around on Instagram. I will see you on Mamma Mia.